The white ranunculus arrived an hour before my wedding. No card, no order slip. The hotel florist swore on her life that nothing had left her cooler that morning. I stood there, stems cold against my gloved palms, trying to remember how to breathe like a bride while my veil hung like a noose on the hook. Only one person alive knew what white ranunculus meant to me. And he had been gone 7 years. I was marrying Grant Holloway because he was safe. Because safe is what remains when the only home you ever knew vanishes without a word for 7 years. What I didn't know was that my signature at that altar was worth $250,000 to the family I was marrying into. If you've ever settled for safe because the real thing shattered you, you know why I kept getting dressed. The flowers were a message. And messages like that don't come from the dead. The dress fit perfectly. That was the strange part, everything about that morning fit, and none of it felt like mine. Grant's mother had planned my wedding the way generals plan landings, the date non-negotiable, the church non-negotiable, the reception rooms booked before Grant had even asked me. I'm a school teacher. I grade spelling tests and know every kid on my block by name, and for 8 months I'd been telling myself that a family who handled everything was a family who cared. The steam iron hissed somewhere down the hall. My cousin laughed in the next room. Normal sounds. A normal morning. Then the Holloway's wedding planner brought the final guest list for my father to review, and I watched him read it. He's a quiet man, my father, a shop on Delancey he's kept open through 3 recessions, hands that always smell faintly of machine oil and pipe tobacco. He read the second page, where 30 names I'd never heard sat under the heading groom's business associates, and the color left his face the way water leaves a sink. Not slowly. All at once. He folded the list into his jacket without a word, and when I asked if everything was all right, he smiled with just his mouth and said the coffee was going right through him. 30 strangers at my wedding, and my father afraid of a piece of paper. I told myself fathers get emotional. I told myself a lot of things that morning. I went back down to the flowers instead, because the flowers at least were a problem I could hold. The florist walked me through her cooler herself, the wet penny smell of cut stems, the compressor humming against my shoulder, and showed me her order book. Roses, peonies, freesia. No ranunculus anywhere. Honey, she said, somebody hand-carried those in. Here's what you have to understand. From the time I was 16 until the week I turned 23, a white ranunculus appeared on my windowsill every Friday. Not roses. Roses were for people who bought love ready-made, he said. Ranunculus, because they look like something ordinary until they open. A boy from Carden Street with grease under his nails and a laugh that made the block feel warmer used to climb my fire escape to leave them, and later, when climbing got ridiculous, he'd just hand them to me at the door and stay for dinner. 6 years of Fridays. Then one Friday the windowsill was empty, and his apartment was empty, and no one on Carden Street would meet my eyes. No note. No fight. No body to bury, which is its own particular cruelty, because grief at least comes with instructions. Nobody else knew about the Fridays. Not my father, not Grant, not one living soul. I should have thrown that bouquet in the trash. I've thought about it 100 times since. I still don't know what would have happened to me if I had. Because when I lifted the ranunculus to move them off my dressing table, something slid against the stems and caught the light. A ring. A thin gold band, worn soft at the edges, the kind of ring a woman wears for 40 years of marriage and passes to her son. I knew it before I touched it. My hands knew it. Luca's mother's wedding band, he'd put it on my finger the summer I was 19, in the back booth at Rocco's with the vinyl seat cracking under us, and said, until I can afford the real one. It disappeared the same week he did. I'd torn my room apart looking for it. I'd spent 7 years believing I lost the last thing he ever gave me, and hating myself for it, and here it was in my bridal bouquet, warm from someone's pocket. The band was heavier than I remembered. I tilted it to the window light and saw why. There was an engraving inside that had never been there before. Fresh cuts, sharp enough to catch my glove. Settled as not safe. I sat down on the little velvet stool because my legs decided that for me. Understand what that ring meant. He hadn't dropped it running. The vanishing was packed for, planned, chosen. And something colder in my chest than the stems had been in my hands, he knew about today. The locked suite, the hand-carried flowers, 3 words aimed at my wedding like a rifle. Not a love note. A warning. I put the band inside my left glove, against my palm, because I couldn't wear it and couldn't leave it, and I went to find my father. Whatever was wrong with that guest list, he was going to look me in the eye and tell me. His door was cracked 2 inches. I raised my hand to knock and stopped, because the voice inside wasn't his. Smooth. Unhurried. Richard Halloway, Grant's father, a man I'd only ever seen holding a drink he never finished. After the ceremony, not before. The signatures happen tonight, Tom. The schedule holds. Paper shuffled. My father's voice came out low, sanded down to nothing. She doesn't know anything. And there's no reason she ever should, Richard said, pleasant as a waiting room. It's estate work. Tax planning. Families do this every day. I stepped back from the door with my heart going like a trapped bird, and I did what I'm still ashamed of. I made myself small and quiet, and I left. When I found my father 20 minutes later in the hallway, I asked him straight out what papers Richard needed signed. He touched my veil and said, "It's nothing, sweetheart. Boring tax things." Then he poured himself coffee, and the cup chattered against the saucer twice before he steadied it with his other hand, and the smell of his pipe tobacco nearly undid me, because that smell had meant safety my whole life and now it meant a man drowning where I could watch. I walked to that church anyway. You have to understand what 7 years of silence does to a person's judgment. My instincts had told me Luca loved me, and then a windowsill sat empty for 7 years of Fridays. So when every instinct I had screamed on the way to St. Ambrose, I filed it under cold feet and kept my chin up like Grant's mother had coached me. The church smelled of incense and lily and cold stone. The organ came up under my feet through the marble. And walking that aisle on my father's arm, I finally saw the guest list made flesh, the groom's side, front rows, 30 men and women I had never met, sitting the way no wedding guest sits. Still. Unsmiling. Hands folded, back straight, people who attend things the way jurors attend things. Grant waited at the altar with a calm I'd always read as steadiness, and for the first time it looked like something else. Like a man watching paperwork clear. We were 40 minutes in, readings done, the priest's voice rolling toward the vows, when I heard it through the stained glass. Engines. Not one. Many, arriving together, and then shutting off together, one clean cut of silence, the way nothing civilian ever moves. I would come back to that silence for the rest of my life. It's the engines stopping that should frighten you, never the engines. My hand was on my father's sleeve, and I felt his arm turn to wood. I looked at his face and my stomach dropped through the marble, because he wasn't surprised. He was recognizing something. A man watching whether he'd been promised finally arrive. Across the nave, Richard Halloway's hand was already inside his jacket, already on his phone, before the doors ever moved. The doors opened mid-vow. I know the priest was speaking because I remember his voice stopping. 7 years does things to a man. It had made this one taller somehow, or stillness does that, A charcoal suit that fit the way weather fits a coastline, 2 men at each door behind him who had the same folded quiet as the front rows. He came up the aisle unhurried, the way I had come up it 20 minutes before, and the 30 strangers did something I will never forget. They inclined. Not a bow. A weather-vane turn, all of them, a room quietly agreeing about where power stood. Somebody's breath went out of them in a word, and the word traveled the pews the way a draft does. Moretti. The boy from Carden Street. The grease under his nails was gone, and everything else the city had ever whispered about that name stood in the aisle of my wedding wearing his face. My knees went loose. Inside my left glove, his mother's ring burned against my palm like a coal. Grant said his name, Mr. Moretti, in a voice I'd never heard him use, the voice you use for a bank examiner. Richard came out of his pew smooth as oil, saying something about a private family occasion. Luca didn't look at either of them. He looked at me the way you look at something you've had to memorize instead of keep, and then he set a single sheet of paper on the altar, on top of the open Bible, and said 5 words. Read it before you sign. It was a ledger page. Old, machine-printed, 1 line highlighted. Thomas Ward. $250,000. And stamped across the entry in ink gone rust brown, purchased in full, Moretti. The date was 7 years old. The same week my windowsill went empty. The flowers with no card. The ring with its fresh warning. My father gray over a guest list. 30 strangers seated like a jury at my wedding. Each of them, alone, could be explained away. Together, they meant my wedding had never once been mine. My father didn't protest and didn't run. He sat down in the front pew like a man whose sentence had finally arrived after years of waiting for it, put his hands on his knees, and stared at the stone floor. And that, more than the motorcade, more than the name moving through the pews, was how I knew every word on that page was true. The priest, God bless him, suggested the sacristy. It was a small room that smelled of candle wax and furniture polish, and it held 5 people and 1 lie, and the lie took up most of the air. Richard went first, because men like Richard always go first. That paper is a forgery, he said, kindly, the way you'd correct a child's arithmetic. Tom's obligations are current and they are ours. I have the instrument in my case. I know you do, Lucas said. It was the first time in 7 years I'd heard his voice do anything but echo in my memory, and it had gone quiet in a way that made the room lean in to hear it. He laid a second document on the vestment table, older, creased, a wax-sealed transfer folder, and then he did the thing that frightened Richard more than any threat could have. He said nothing at all. He let the 2 papers sit there side by side like 2 versions of the same 7 years. Grant kept saying my name. Elena. Elena, be reasonable. 3 times, 4, always with that little downward pressure on it, and somewhere in the wax-smelling quiet I realized he said my name the way his father's office probably stamped past due, not a person, a payment reminder. The man I'd almost married an hour ago. I felt the band through my glove and couldn't remember his middle name. There are 2 versions of one dead in this room, I said, and my voice only shook on the first word. One of them says my father's debt died 7 years ago. One of them says it's alive and belongs to the Halloways. Somebody forged something. Ask him about the marriage contract, Lucas said, still not looking at Richard. Article 6. The consolidation schedule. Ask him why it executes tonight, before the register office opens, and why the witnesses are already seated in the pews. He recited it the way you recite an address you've stood outside too many nights, a man who had watched this wedding being assembled bolt by bolt for months, from wherever it is he'd been standing for 7 years. Richard's smile stayed. His eyes did arithmetic. Why, I said to Luca, and the whole 7 years went into the one word. You don't get to walk in here with paper. Where were you? Something crossed his face then, the first crack in all that stillness, quick as a fish turning. Ask your father, he said gently, which week I left. And which week the debt died. Stay with me here, because this is the part one still can't tell without my hands going cold. My father talked to the floor. The shop on Delancey had been going under for years. I knew that. I'd done homework at that counter under the smell of machine oil while he juggled suppliers. What I didn't know, 7 years ago he'd covered the house and the shop with $250,000 from a private lender, the kind whose paper gets sold and resold until it lands with people who collect in other currencies. It landed with a brokerage. Holloway and Sons. And when Richard's people came to assess the collateral, what they assessed was me. A daughter. 22, dutiful, unmarried. Leverage, my father said, and the word came out of him like a pulled tooth. Luca finished it, in pieces, with long stops, and I understood the stops were him deciding, over and over, to keep going. The Moretti name I'd never once connected to the boy on my fire escape. His father held the seat then, and Luca had spent his whole life refusing it, working transmissions on Carden Street under his mother's maiden name. Until Holloway paper put me on a collections list. Then the family that had wanted its heir finally had a price he'd pay. He took the seat. The debt was purchased and buried the same week, stamped dead, no interest, no shadow, on one condition his father and the Holloways both required, because a Don's first love is a Don's first hostage, distance. He stays gone, I stay invisible, the protection holds. You were the payment, I said. I was the payment, he said. And every Friday I broke the terms anyway. He looked at the glove where the band was, so he'd known exactly where it was all along. There were flowers some years, when I could route them so they couldn't be traced to you. There were years there couldn't be anything at all. Those were paid for differently. He didn't say how. The candle wax ticked in its holder, and I did not ask, and that not asking was the first fluent sentence I ever spoke in the language of his world. 7 years I'd built him into a man who got bored of me. It would have hurt less if he had. You can bury abandonment. You cannot bury the knowledge that every empty Friday was somebody paying your invisible rent. That was when the sacristy door swung, and Grant's mother stood in it with her cathedral voice on. Richard. They're waiting. And past her shoulder I heard it, Richard hadn't been stalling in that little room at all. He'd been letting his son and his lawyer work the knave. Out there, in front of 30 witnesses convened for exactly this, the live version of my father's debt was being read into the wedding like a second set of bands, with my father as Exhibit 1. The consolidation goes through tonight, Richard said to no one in particular, with or without the ceremony. The paper is the paper. And for one long moment, in the middle of that wreckage, he looked genuinely content, a man whose contingencies had contingencies. Luca picked up his 2 documents, and his stillness had changed temperature. You're right, he said. The paper is the paper. Let's read it to your witnesses. He walked back into the nave alone. 1 man, 30 jurors, and 2 versions of the truth. I followed, because it was my wedding and my father and my name on their schedule, and I was done hearing about my life through 2 inches of cracked door. The nave had rearranged itself. The 30 sat where they'd sat all along. They had never been Grant's guests. They were the audience Richard had convened to watch him land the Ward properties clean, respectable, notarized. Richard's lawyer had the marriage contract open on a lectern like a second gospel, and now I heard my own wedding read out plainly, on execution of the marriage, the Ward house, the shop on Delancey, and all attached obligations passed into Holloway family administration. By midnight, the timeline initialed in the margin in Grant's handwriting, I recognized the fussy little G. He hadn't been told. He'd drafted it. Luca didn't raise his voice. That's the thing nobody warns you about power, the real kind never needs volume. He set both ledgers on the altar rail, dead one beside live one, and asked one of the front row strangers by name, Don Casella, if he would do the room the courtesy of reading the dates. An old man rose, took out reading glasses like this was probate court, and the church got so quiet I could hear his glasses case click shut. Wax and incense. My own pulse in my ears. The Moretti instrument is stamped and countersigned 7 years ago, the old man said at last. The Holloway instrument is printed on stock watermarked 3 years ago. He removed the glasses. A debt cannot be alive in a document younger than its own death. That was all. That was the whole gunfight, a watermark, read aloud by a man Richard himself had invited. He had assembled the exact people whose respect his business ran on, to witness his cleverness. Forged paper in front of that room was the end of the only currency he had. The deference in that church turned like a tide going out. 1 minute it lay with the man in the pew, the next with the man at the rail. Richard buttoned his jacket once and walked out of St. Ambrose with his lawyer, and nobody stood to walk with him. And I understood that in his world, that was the entire sentence, served in full. Grant stayed. Give him that. He stood in front of me with the church watching, chose his words, and said, Elena, the consolidation was supposed to settle it. The marriage made everyone whole. It was good structure. Not I loved you. Not I'm sorry. Good structure. Everyone heard it, which meant everyone finally knew what I was to the Holloways, including me. And Luca, who had every right of conquest that world recognizes, who could have taken my hand in front of his 30 inclined heads and made it law, did the one thing I never saw coming. He held out his open hand, and I gave him his mother's band from my glove, not understanding yet. He set it on the altar beside the dead ledger. The debt died 7 years ago, he said to the room. Nobody in this building owes me anything. Then, only to me, quieter, including you. And he walked out of my wedding the same way he'd walked in. Unhurried. Alone. I stood at that altar in a dress the Holloways had approved. Between the bouquet I'd carried and the ring he'd left, the church doors open on the gray afternoon, and I didn't move for what felt like a year. My father sat in the front pew with his sentence lifted off him and his shame still on. Down the steps, engines were waking one by one. Every instinct I'd learned in 7 years said a man who leaves is a man who leaves. But he hadn't left the choice. That was the point of the ring on the altar. For 7 years everyone in my life had decided things for me in locked rooms, my father, the Holloways, even Luca, even the protecting. The man walking to those cars had just handed the deciding back, in public, at cost, in front of the exact world that would read it as weakness. I picked up the band, and I ran. Down the aisle in my wedding dress, past the 30 faces, out onto the steps into air that smelled of rain on stone, and the sight of me stopped him at the car door like a hand on his chest. Luca Moretti, I said, and watched half the street go still at the name. Then I said the rest of it. From Carden Street. You still owe me 7 years of Fridays. Whatever the city thinks lives inside that man, I watched it crack down the middle on a church step. He came back up 3 stairs like each one had to be allowed, took the band from my palm, and this time nobody's permission was in the room, nobody's terms, nobody's paper, and he put it on my finger where every one of them could see. The metal was warm. It had been warm for 7 years, is what I finally understood. It had just been warm somewhere I couldn't feel it. Settled is not safe, I said. No, he said, against my hair. But you will be both. The Halloways got one last swing in, of course they did. That same night, before my mascara was dry, a motion landed on my father's shop, procedural, spiteful, a lean challenge with Richard's lawyer's letterhead. I found out because I was there when Luca read it, and I watched, fascinated and a little cold, how his world answers paper. Not with what I feared. With telephones. By Friday, every house that had sat in those pews had quietly closed its accounts with Halloway and Sons, the tide going out the rest of the way, and the following week a courier brought my father a flat envelope, the deed to the shop on Delancey, unencumbered, retitled in his name alone. No Moretti's signature anywhere on it. It has to be his, Luca told me, or it's just a different collar. My father cried at his own counter, into the smell of machine oil, and I let him, and that was its own kind of wedding. As for me, I went in with my eyes open, which is the only way I'd agree to go. Terms, not surrender, my school stays mine, my name stays mine, and nothing true gets decided in rooms I'm not in. He agreed like a man who'd spent 7 years wishing someone would make him. Yesterday was a Friday. There's a jam jar on the windowsill of my classroom now, and every Friday it fills with white ranunculus, hand-carried, no card, because some signatures you don't need ink for. If you looked in from the street you'd see nothing worth slowing down for. Chalk dust in the afternoon light, a stack of spelling tests, a woman by the window turning a thin gold band on her finger, worn soft by his mother's 40 years and just beginning, at last, to wear itself into mine. Safe was never the opposite of danger, it was the opposite of being truly known. 7 years of silence, bought and paid to keep her breathing, would you have forgiven it, or was the lie too long? If stories like this make your heart race, subscribe to Raven Vow.